Does that hoodie deserve a seat in first class? No, at least. Not if you ask the kind of people who measure human worth by the logo stitched on a collar or the thread count of the fabric they wear. And no, if you believe that dignity can only exist when paired with handcrafted Italian leather shoes or a limited edition Swiss watch. But if you had witnessed the way that woman walked in silent composed, as if the world were a grand stage and she had no need to perform, you'd understand the hoodie didn't need to belong. It didn't need permission. It just needed to be present. It was an international flight from Los Angeles to Geneva Hathaway Air Prestige's flagship business class route, where America's wealthiest shared airspace with those who believed money bought the right to judge. The seats were wrapped in Italian leather. Wine was poured from private cellars. Conversations often began with, "I just closed a 9-figure deal." And then she walked in. A cream-colored hoodie printed with a simple polar bear. No designer label, no tailored fit, no fashion statement begging to be noticed. She didn't scan the cabin for her seat, nor did she seek anyone's approval. She simply sat down in seat 1A, placed a worn book on her lap, and turned to the first page. Pride and Prejudice, her faithful comfort on every flight. She wasn't here to be welcomed. She was here to be left alone. Behind her, a few chuckles echoed, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through polished suits. Preston Vaughan, founder of Vaughan Capital, curled his lip as if something had offended his aesthetic senses. "I don't recall the airline allowing ground crew to test out first class," he sneered. Another voice chimed in, "Maybe it's part of a sponsorship program. She kind of matches the airline's mascot." But what stood out most was this: she didn't hear a thing. Not because she was deaf, but because her mind was elsewhere. Somewhere Jane Austen was still writing words that forced the aristocracy to examine itself. In that place, cheap remarks couldn't reach her. While the men around her scrambled to define status by net worth, she, the woman in the hoodie, was quietly owning the airline they were flying on, and silently evaluating the quality of the people aboard her sky. Alexandra Hathaway, 40 years old, is a woman with dark brown hair, cascading in soft waves like gentle tides. She was once the founder of the first sustainable fashion brand ever to appear on the cover of Forbes Women Under 30. People called her the new face of refined feminism, not loud, not showy, but impossible to ignore in any room she entered. Yet during her journey to becoming the wife of Nicholas Hathaway, the most powerful man in the private aviation industry, she chose to vanish from the headlines. She sold her brand, stepped out of the spotlight, and instead of investing in her image, she began investing in people, specifically through the Hathaway Foundation, where she now oversees hundreds of millions of dollars annually in funding for education, the environment, and public health. No one in first class today recognized her. And that was exactly how Alexandra intended it. She didn't fly private, though she could. She didn't use her CEO privileges, though she had every right. She booked her commercial ticket, under an alias, arrived on time, rolled her own luggage, made no special requests, and accepted no preferential treatment from the crew except for one thing: never speak her real name in front of others. Elena, the lead flight attendant, was one of the few who knew this. After years of working the Hathaway family route, she understood that not everyone with power wants to be bowed to. A subtle nod was enough to acknowledge familiarity. Nothing more was needed. First class gradually filled with men in bespoke suits, women in cinched silk dresses, Hermes bags dangling effortlessly from their wrists, their glances weaving through the cabin like silent inventories of power and pedigree. The conversations surrounding Alexandra were composed of cold keywords: new investment funds, a penthouse in Milan, golf handicaps, energy stocks, but she remained detached. Her eyes traced each line of prose as if those multi-million-dollar dialogues unfolding around her belonged to a world she had long since chosen to leave behind. When Preston Vaughan realized that the woman in the hoodie had no intention of leaving or even appearing the least bit embarrassed, he decided to escalate. Because for men like Preston, silence isn't seen as a choice. It's an insult. He leaned slightly over, voice pitched just loud enough for half the cabin to hear while still pretending to be civil. Usually people try to dress decently when sitting here, out of respect for the space, if you know what I mean. Alexandra didn't respond. No sigh, no frown. She simply marked her page with a museum pass from the Museum of Modern Art and shifted her posture. Preston turned to a younger businessman beside him who had introduced himself as James Marston, Chief Strategy Officer of a rising financial firm, and as if he had found an ally, let out a mocking chuckle. I guess someone just got lucky with an upgrade. The airline's gotten rather generous lately. Laughter trickled through the cabin. Not loud, but just enough to build an invisible wall separating Alexandra from the rest. She didn't look up, not because she was intimidated, but because her focus was exactly where it needed to be, on the only thing of value in that moment, Jane Austen's reminder that the world has always been full of men confident enough to think they have the right to judge a woman based solely on her appearance. Preston continued this time with a probing question, or more precisely, a veiled strike. So, what do you do if you don't mind me asking? Alexandra looked up. Her voice was even and light, like background music. I run a charitable foundation. Preston raised an eyebrow, as though she had just confessed to being unemployed. Oh, the world does need people to save polar bears and teach kids in wherever. James jumped in, unable to hide his smirk. Adorable hobby. I once donated to an elementary school myself, had to earn some PR points back then. Alexandra said nothing more. She knew their type. The kind of men who only respect power when it's wearing a Rolex, driving a Maybach, and seated in a crystal conference room. Men who live by the assumption that a woman's value is defined by the husband she marries, the number of followers she has, or how tightly her dress hugs her figure. They didn't know that Alexandra Hathaway was sitting right there, not flaunting, but quietly owning more than all of them combined: wealth, influence, and freedom from every cheap assumption they clung to. And it was precisely because she didn't argue, didn't bite back, that they grew more uneasy. Because something about her presence whispered that they were misjudging her, but they were far too arrogant to stop. Elena, the flight's lead attendant, returned to the cabin, carrying a suede-bound menu. She approached Alexandra without any overdone greeting, without calling out her name, and without lowering her voice in the usual sycophantic tone reserved for first class. Just one simple question, soft enough for only two to hear. Will you be having the salmon or the beef today, ma'am? The word ma'am was not uttered in the usual polite form. It carried a kind of respect that's hard to define. Not the kind reserved for the wealthy, but for someone long accustomed to being served without ever needing to remind others who she was. Alexandra lifted her gaze from her book, her expression just as serene as before, and replied with effortless calm, "Salmon." "Thank you, Elena." The way she said Elena's name without looking at a name tag, without having to ask, was oddly precise and natural. Preston momentarily paused in the act of adjusting his napkin. His eyes flicked between the two women as if trying to eavesdrop on something invisible. A few minutes later, an older woman seated 2 rows ahead turned her head slightly. She carried the aura of someone who had once commanded rooms full of influence. It was Sabrina Ellington, CEO of Ellington Capital, a name well known in the global investment world. She studied Alexandra for a long moment, her gaze betraying a tinge of recognition. Finally, in a voice just above a whisper, she spoke, "Forgive me if I'm mistaken, but didn't we meet at the Montreux event 3 years ago, the fundraiser for women's education?" Alexandra simply smiled. No confirmation, no denial. She tilted her head, as if recalling something, then offered a small nod. Nothing more was said, but for Sabrina, that was enough. She closed her laptop, and for the rest of the flight, didn't glance back even once. The air in the cabin seemed to shift. No one spoke it aloud, but something had clearly changed. Preston began to feel uneasy. It was a sensation he wasn't used to, and so instinctively, he retreated to the game he played best, asserting dominance through detail. He ordered a glass of Macallan 18, emphasizing that the ice be cut to the exact size, the glass from the correct Baccarat line, and the flavor served just as he was accustomed to being served. Alexandra kept reading unbothered, but anyone paying attention would have noticed the silence around her was no longer odd. It had become unsettling. Her lack of response, her refusal to defend herself, was beginning to force those who once scoffed to now examine themselves. Perhaps for the first time during this flight, they weren't so sure they were judging her correctly. And when the elite are no longer sure of what or who they're looking at, caution creeps in. The meal was served in what seemed like a peaceful atmosphere. A faint aroma of steamed salmon rose from Alexandra's tray while Preston Vaughan was busy muttering complaints about the doneness of his beef. No one had asked for his opinion, but he shared it anyway, as if delivering a keynote at a gourmet symposium. Suddenly, he turned toward Alexandra. His voice deliberately softened, attempting to mask his usual condescension. "I still haven't quite figured it out." He began, his eyes scanning her as though weighing her worth. "For someone who does charity work full-time, how exactly do you afford a seat up here? I'm torn between 3 options, husband, boyfriend, or lucky golden ticket." Alexandra didn't reply. She set her water glass back on the tray, her gaze still resting on the page. Jane Austen, it seemed, continued to hold her attention, more than anything just spoken aloud. Preston couldn't bear the silence. He went on, this time with a clearer laugh and a louder tone. "I mean no offense, of course. It's just that up here, people usually recognize each other by business cards or international summit name tags. And you, polar bears and 19th century English literature. That's certainly unique." James Marston, the young executive beside him, leaned in with a smirk, clearly enjoying the moment. He added a line polished for just this kind of performance. "Maybe she's a new post-pandemic icon of minimalist fashion, challenging stereotypes with fleece and nameless shoes." Preston burst out laughing. James joined in. A man a few rows back chuckled too, though perhaps he didn't even understand what had just been said. Alexandra closed her book. No haste, no sound. She gently fastened the page she'd been reading with a thin silk ribbon. Then slowly she turned her head toward Preston. It was the first time since the beginning of the flight that she looked directly at him, not with anger, not with coldness, but with the calm gaze of someone too composed to be offended, too self-aware to need to explain. A look that made Preston, the man who thought he had control over the situation, instinctively lower his eyes. He recovered by pouring himself another drink. As his glass filled, he lifted it and delivered one final remark, like a blade drawn with a smirk. "Well, I suppose everyone has their way of landing certain seats, even if they weren't exactly born to sit in them." From the other side of the cabin, Sabrina Ellington looked up from her screen. Her voice was clear, not loud, but strong enough to make everyone nearby pause mid-chew. And then there are those who don't need to land a seat. They built the entire airport just to place chairs wherever they please. No one laughed after that. Preston said nothing. Alexandra reopened her book. The plane began its slow descent. Outside the window, the sky was tinted gold, like a mirror, softening at dusk. A few passengers checked their body clocks, ordered another coffee, and adjusted their ties. Preston checked his phone, knowing full well there was no signal. He was used to being the first to be contacted whenever important news broke, and this time was no exception. Elena reappeared, walking swiftly and discreetly to his seat. She handed him a neatly folded slip of paper marked with a priority tag. "A message from the ground, Mr. Vaughan, delivered directly to you," she said, her voice void of emotion. Preston took it and unfolded it. For a split second, the color in his face seemed to drain by a shade. The message was simple, just one line. "Mr. Nicholas Hathaway, chairman of Hathaway Air, requests to meet you in the VIP lounge immediately after landing." Below that was a verified signature from the airline's Special Protocol Division. Preston froze. A personal meeting with Nicholas Hathaway wasn't something that just happened, especially when there had been no invitation prior to the flight. He glanced around the cabin as if hoping to find some clue to explain it, and then almost instinctively looked at Alexandra, the woman he had spent the entire flight treating as a social joke. She was still reading, her expression unchanged, not a single glance toward the paper in his hand, as if she had no idea what was happening. James, his young travel companion, leaned across the aisle, trying to sneak a peek at the message. When he saw who had signed it, he whispered, just loud enough, "You're kidding. Hathaway asked to meet you. That's major." Preston quickly folded the paper shut, his voice flustered but laced with forced pride. He must have heard about my new fund, or recognized I'm someone worth his time. He said it, but the last sentence lacked his usual conviction. In seat 1A, Alexandra closed her book and adjusted her seatbelt as the indicator lit up. Nothing extravagant, nothing unnecessary. Preston looked at her, truly looked for the first time. Not at the hoodie, not at the nameless flats, but at her calm face, her effortless composure, and the suspicious silence that had wrapped itself around her for the entire flight. He wanted to ask something, but didn't, because a vague fear had started to creep into his mind. If she wasn't just anyone, then maybe, just maybe, it was those 2 moments of mockery that had been the real breach of class. As the plane touched down on the runway, no one was thinking about turbulence or delays. All attention in first class had shifted to something no one dared speak aloud: the unclear connection between the woman in the hoodie and the name Nicholas Hathaway, a man known for never meeting anyone unless they were worth hundreds of millions. Preston tried to maintain his composure, though his hands were now gently clenched. James kept glancing at Alexandra, who had risen from her seat. Once the seatbelt light dimmed, adjusted the strap on her simple canvas bag, and nodded politely at Elena. No words of thanks needed, because true respect doesn't rely on words. The cabin door opened. Light from the VIP lounge spilled in, ushering them from the confined cabin into the real world. First-class passengers stepped out with their usual urgency, each moving like the star of their own stage. But Alexandra didn't rush. She walked calmly through the corridor, her pace just steady enough to keep anyone from passing her. At the wide glass lobby of the private reception area, she stopped. Standing ahead was a tall man, hair dark streaked with silver. No tie, his tailored suit worn with understated authority. His expression was firm but warm. Nicholas Hathaway. The moment his eyes met Alexandra's, his stern face softened, as if everything that truly mattered had just walked into view. He stepped forward. She said nothing. She didn't smile. But when he wrapped her in his arms, right there in full view of every passenger in the cabin, the final question, lingering in everyone's mind, was instantly answered. Preston stood less than 2 meters away. His face was pale, fingers clenched around the still-folded message slip. James took a subtle step back, as if distance might somehow ease the weight of the shame now pressing down on his shoulders. Nicholas turned, placed a hand gently around his wife's shoulder, and looked directly toward the small crowd still watching. His voice was deep, deliberate, like a precise incision. "Thank you, gentlemen, for accompanying my wife on her flight today. I trust it was a memorable journey." Alexandra said nothing. She didn't need to. She glanced back at Preston, not with anger, not with smugness, just a look quiet and final that made the man who had once mocked her lower his eyes, as if by instinct. She lightly touched Nicholas's hand, and together they exited the lounge, not like victors, but like two people who had simply walked free. Behind them, no one said a word, because the truly terrifying thing wasn't that they had been wrong. It was that they had been wrong from the very first moment because of a hoodie and a silence that never needed to justify itself. The car had already pulled away from the VIP arrival area, carrying Alexandra and Nicholas Hathaway back into the world they had built with quiet resolve and unwavering integrity. Inside the glass lounge, a heavy stillness lingered. 3 men stood frozen, as if something had been lost that couldn't quite be named. Preston watched the car until it disappeared behind a row of marble columns. Then slowly, he lowered his gaze to the watch on his wrist, as if to remind himself that time still moved, though his pride had just collapsed. From a distance, Elena passed silently through the space. When her eyes met Preston's, she didn't smile. She didn't speak. It was just a look, but it was enough to remind him that sometimes the one most underestimated is the one quietly reassessing everyone else. He turned away not out of anger, but out of shame. Elsewhere in the terminal, Sabrina Ellington ended a call with her assistant, stepped out of the lounge, and gave a discreet nod to the airport staff. She had met many powerful people in her life, but few left a resonance. Like Alexandra Hathaway, someone who didn't need to teach anyone a lesson, because simply being true to herself allowed the truth to do it for her. Then came a notification on Preston's phone from his assistant. Hathaway Air has declined the investment proposal. The rejection was personally signed by Nicholas. There were no words left to defend himself. He knew without question that he had just slammed shut the biggest door his career might ever open, simply because he had underestimated a woman who didn't dress the way he expected. Perhaps that hoodie wasn't expensive, but in that moment, it was worth more than any suit worn on that flight, because it had become a symbol of pride that didn't need polish and of kindness that never asked to be proven. This story reminds us true value isn't in the clothes you wear, but in how you treat others, especially when you think they don't matter. Alexandra didn't need to argue. She didn't need to prove anything. She simply walked with quiet grace and let the truth speak for itself. The lesson here is crystal clear. Never rush to judge someone by appearances. Kindness and dignity don't boast, but when they show up, they have the power to silence an entire room. If this story touched you, please hit like, leave a comment, and share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe to Toch Story so you never miss the stories that move your heart and change the way we see the world. See you in the next video.